After 6 seasons and 63 episodes, Better Call Saul has finally ended, bringing to a close one of the most consistently good TV shows of all time. So consistent, in fact, that making this video has proven to be quite a challenge, since I think a lot of people can agree that there isn't a single bad episode in the entire series. Even so, I decided I wanted to try and rank them all anyway, because ranking things is fun. Before we start, I want to make it crystal clear that I like every episode of the show, so don't go into the comments to complain when I put your favourite episode in the bottom 10. To be honest, most of the episodes in this list are basically interchangeable, with the exception of the top 20 or so. Also, obviously this list is my opinion, and as a warning, I've had a lot of people in the past tell me that I do have some rather unconventional tastes in regards to this show. With all that said, this is every Better Call Saul episode ranked. Number 63, Barley High. Deciding which episode to put at the bottom of this list was quite the arduous task, but when it came down to it, I had to put this one as my least favourite. As I said before, it's not a bad episode by any means, it's just not as good as the other ones. The highlight of this episode is Mike's back and forth with Hector and his goons, especially the scene that calls back to his stealth mission in full measure. It culminates in a scene where he and Hector face off, and if you can get past his horrendous accent,
and the gun is yours.
It's pretty good stuff. The twins also show up to continue their role from Breaking Bad of doing nothing. My favourite scene of this episode is when Kim and Rich Schweikart, one of the best side characters, have lunch after Kim loses a sandpiper hearing. Rich tells this great story about how his boss wasn't there for him at a big hearing, which obviously parallels Kim's current standing with Howard. And of course the cold open is also great, with Jimmy being unable to fall asleep at his cushy Davis and Maine apartment, until he eventually gives up and drives back to the nail salon where he falls asleep instantly. A good episode, but it's sandwiched between two much better ones that we'll get to later. Number 62, Talk. This episode features the start of Jimmy's tenure at CC Mobile, so for that reason alone, this is already a good episode. But on top of that, we have Kim beginning her public defender work, Mike trolling at the support group meeting, and most importantly, Nacho and the twins shooting a bunch of guys for no reason. I actually do like this shootout, since the twins don't act as stupid as they usually do in other action scenes, beyond them deciding to go in by themselves in the first place. And Nacho even gets a slice of the action, securing his first kill in the process. This is one of the few times the twins actually do something of note, so that is a bonus. We also get the only time we ever see younger Mike, or at least we kind of see him. This episode does kind of suffer from my least favourite aspect of Mike's story in the show, the back and forth about whether he is actually working for Gus or not. It doesn't matter that much though, since next episode is when the Super Lab plot begins, and things are smooth sailing for the rest of the season. Number 61, Namaste. There's some really good scenes in this episode, with the standout being Jimmy's lunch with Howard, which shows just how far Howard has come compared to where he was in season 4, and how Jimmy still holds a lot of resentment towards him, which we obviously see at the end of the episode when he throws the bowling balls on his car. There's also the courtroom scene with a fake defendant, which is classic Saul Goodman shenanigans. My main issue with this episode is Hank and Gomez's involvement, who were introduced in the previous episode. Something about their dialogue just feels off to me in a way that I can't really explain, and I don't give a shit about their stakeout adventure. I do like the parallel scenes of Gus tormenting Lyle with cleaning the fry repeatedly, which is both amusing and good insight into how Gus is feeling at that moment. Not a bad episode, but not a standout by any means. Number 60, the guy for this. Hank and Gomez joined the show this episode, and I have mixed feelings. It does make sense for them to be here for the Crazy 8 plot, but their back and forth banter just feels forced to me.
Once I found an old can of vanilla frosting, I hate that. I'm still here.
You what?
I may be biased though, since I wasn't exactly the biggest Hank fan when watching Breaking Bad. It's also kind of distracting that Gomez's actor couldn't be bothered to shave his goatee, but it doesn't really matter. Thankfully, everything else in the episode is very good. Jimmy meeting Lalo was something that we were waiting for from the moment Lalo joined the show. Lalo mentions that Tuco told him about Jimmy, which makes me a bit disappointed we never got a Tuco-Lalo scene in the show. Kim's struggle with her pro bono work versus Mesa Verde comes to a head with Acker, who Mesa Verde is trying to force off his property so they can build a call center there. The most memorable part of this episode is probably the cold open, which very artfully shows Jimmy's ice cream from the previous episode being consumed by ants, which he sees later on in the episode. You can make 500 hours worth of video essays based on this scene alone. Number 59, 50% off. There's some pretty wacky hijinks in this episode. like Nacho's parkour adventure to grab drugs from a building seconds away from it being busted by the feds, which gets him on Lalo's good side, Jimmy's elevator scheme to get Suzanne Erickson to work with him, and Mike yelling at his 10-year-old granddaughter for being shit at her times tables. Jimmy also comes face to face with Nacho after not having seen him since early season 1, and we find out how Crazy 8 got his nickname, which is intriguing. Jimmy and Kim visit an open house, which would have been the perfect chance for a Marie cameo, but alas, we do not get that. Gus gets to show just how big of an arsehole he can be by threatening to murder Nacho's father if he doesn't do what he demands. I'm not a huge fan of Mike's moody drunk loser arc in the first half of his season, but it was probably necessary after what he did at the end of season 4, and who doesn't love seeing Mike yell at children? Number 58, Breathe. The obvious highlight of this episode is the ending, where Gus murders Arturo with a plastic bag and makes Nacho watch, and then drops the hardest line in Gus Fring history.
From now on, you are mine.
I've said before that I'm not the biggest fan of Gus in the show, but this is probably his best scene. Kim yelling at Howard is also a great scene. Howard really just can't catch a break during the entirety of the show. Mike meets up with Lydia at this very cinematic location, and I like their back and forth about Mike's security consultant shenanigans. Any scene that has Lydia in it is already top tier anyway. The other highlight here is Jimmy's job interview at the copier place. When it seems like they're going to pass him up, he goes back in and makes this great speech about how good he is at selling copiers, but then they decide to hire him on the spot. He suddenly changes his mind and calls him beta cucks. Jimmy's character is definitely at its most complex this season. I think that's a big part of why it's so good, even if some people think it's boring compared to the other seasons. Number 57, Sabrosito. This episode is split pretty much perfectly in half between the Gus plot and the real plot, with the first half being Hector's field trip to Pollos Hermanos to troll the customers, and the second half laying the groundwork for the big face-off against Chuck next episode. Gus shows what a good boss he is by giving a rousing speech about how cool he is to his workers, and this is the exact moment when Lyle decided to dedicate the rest of his life to Pollos Hermanos. We get the return of a yellow piss filter from Breaking Bad, along with Don Eladio very subtly foreshadowing his own demise. This episode also has the only time Mike and Chuck ever interacted, which is a shame, but it also makes this episode stand out more. The scene where Jimmy, Kim, Howard, and Chuck argue about the details of Jimmy's confession is great, and it's revealed to the surprise of no one that Chuck has a copy of a tape Jimmy destroyed, which ends up working out in Jimmy's favour next episode. Overall, a damn good episode that gets overshadowed by what comes after it. Number 56, Breaking Bad. Better Call Saul having an episode called Breaking Bad is a prediction that I think everyone had, but didn't think would actually happen, and yet it did. And while this episode isn't the full-length Breaking Bad episode we were all hoping for, it does use the scenes from that era to parallel Gene and Jeff's wacky adventures, where they themselves become the breakers of bad. Obviously, the fact that this episode has Walt and Jesse in it is enough to catapult it into everyone's top 10, but for me it was low-key the worst scene of the episode. It does flesh out Saul's involvement in the early days of their meth trade, but it kind of felt like the writers decided they wanted a Walt and Jesse scene first, and then wrote a scene around that, as opposed to the other way around. On the opposite end, the Mike scene is great, since his and Saul's dynamic is something I wish we got more of in Breaking Bad, and I still wish we got more of it in general. And it obviously shows how Saul was unable to resist the urge to make a shit ton of money, leading to him making the biggest mistake of his life when he goes to Walt's school. The intercutting between that scene and Gene breaking into Cancer Guy's house was very kino. Seeing the cold open of this episode for the first time was one of the most hype moments of the whole show, and for the most part, Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul did a very good job at playing their characters again. More so Cranston than Paul in this episode, but I think Aaron did a way better job in the Jesse scene next episode. It was also pretty surreal to find out what happened to a lot of random characters after Breaking Bad, like getting confirmation that Skylar got her deal, Huel got out of a safe house and went back home, Price is probably in jail, and Kubi is who knows where. Number 55. Rebecca. This is the episode where Kim really comes into her own as a character, after Jimmy's advert stunt for Davis and Maine ends up with her down in the cornfields. The montage of her trying to drum up new business to get back in Howard's good graces is one of my favourites. The opening of this episode is one of the best examples of why Chuck hates Jimmy so much, when Rebecca laughs at all of Jimmy's lawyer jokes, but Chuck's is an epic fail. Jimmy also starts getting babysat by Aaron Brill, which he definitely is not happy about. This episode probably also has Howard at his most asshole-ish, to the point where Chuck has to step in to get Kim out of doc review. Thankfully, Howard eventually gets what he deserves for that. Number 54. Sunk Costs. Jimmy goes to jail after his epic fail in the previous episode, and says to Chuck probably the coldest thing he's ever said in either show.
One day you're gonna get sick. Again. Hook you up to those machines that beep and whir, and this time it'll be too much. and you will die there, alone.
This episode is one of the funniest montages in the whole show of Kim's morning routine. They were clearly going for an Edgar Wright-esque quick cuts type thing, and combined with the awesome song they used, makes this a standout in a show full of cool montages. This is sadly the last chronological appearance of Ernesto, not counting the flashback and winner. I'm still mad that he didn't show up to shit on Howard's grave in season 6. Mike's continued trolling of Hector, now with Gus's approval, is all well and good, but Jimmy's storyline at this point in the show is so good that it kinda overshadows Mike's plot for pretty much all of this season. Which is a shame, because I do like seeing the early stages of Mike and Gus's relationship, even if it does feel like the writers weren't entirely sure how to get from point A to point B. And of course the last scene of this episode of Jimmy and Kim discussing their plan to fight against Chuck, set against that amazing backdrop of the glass block windows, is probably one of the best visuals of the show.
I think the most memorable experience of Saul for me was doing, well, they're all so memorable and my favorite, but episode 303, Sunk Costs, the one where Bill and Jimmy are on the bench in the courthouse, and he has the burger and the fries to entice Bill. And the reason that it shines a little brighter for me than the other episodes is that, well, Bob and I had the opportunity to rehearse. He invited me to the studio to rehearse the scene, and I couldn't because I had my daughter with me. So he actually rode his bike over to my house, and we rehearsed it while I was wearing my infant daughter in an ergo baby carrier. But because we had the opportunity to rehearse it so much, by the time we got to filming, we were so comfortable with it that we could find new things, we could explore new avenues, and we had the pace down, we had the rhythms down, we had the words were there. And they initially wanted to do a whole bunch of different camera setups, but because we had the scene down so well, they were able to just set up a camera. And I think the first 2 minutes of that scene with us is just one shot, it's just one camera, no cuts.
The original cameo I got from Peter was like 9 minutes long and went way more in depth into like every single episode he was in, so big thanks to him for going above and beyond what I expected, and I would highly recommend his cameo. Anyways, moving on. Number 53, Marco. This is a weird one for me. This episode comes right after the earth-shattering reveal that Chuck is in fact a bigger arsehole than we thought, and I think the first act of this episode deals with that pretty perfectly. I like seeing Jimmy and Howard make amends, and it makes me long for the friendship they could have had, and of course Jimmy's rant about bingo hall is the stuff of legends. Probably one of Odenkirk's best acted scenes in the whole show. It's a shame we never got to see the sunroof incident though. Unfortunately, once Jimmy goes back to Cicero, I sort of lose interest, because to be perfectly frank, I just do not care about Marco at all. This episode is still obviously very important for Jimmy's character, but compared to other season finales, I do consider this one the least good. At least we got the moment Jimmy became Kevin Costner to make up for it. Thankfully, the ending of the episode brings it back. Very epic moment to end the season on, even though you could make the case that the next episode backtracks it. Number 52. Slip. Jimmy does a slip and fall, Nacho slips some sugar pills into Hector's jacket, and Kim slips Howard a check. The scene where Nacho does the pill swap was one of the most tense scenes in the whole show for me, and this is weak sauce compared to what Nacho goes through in the rest of the show, and I do love a good bottle throwing training montage. Jimmy being helpful to his fellow community service workers could be seen as setting up his popularity in prison at the end of the show, but probably not. We get to see Mike's disdain for normal citizens being killed by people in the game, when he uses a metal detector to find the Good Samaritan's dead body so that his family can get closure. This obviously parallels Howard's death when Mike is forced to bury him in a random hole, so no one will ever know the truth, at least until Kim confesses years later. Chuck begins his journey to rid himself of EHS, which will hopefully lead to him living a prosperous life free of any illness. Number 51. Carrot and Stick. The best part of this episode is obviously the return of the Queen Betsy Kettleman and Craig Kettleman, who Jimmy and Kim use in their tirade against Howard. But the focus of this episode, like the first of season 6, is all on Ignacio's adventure. When watching this season for the first time, every single scene of Nacho was tense as hell because it really did feel like he could die at any moment. When the twins show up for another epic shootout, it does get a bit stupid, since the twins would rather stand around and look badass than actually get the job done. I think the shootout and talk was way better, personally. Gus continues to be a massive asshole when it becomes obvious that he was setting up Nacho all along. We get to see where Saul ended up getting his inflatable Statue of Liberty from, although it's kinda lame that we didn't get to see how he got it from the Kettlemans. unless he just got another inflatable that looks exactly the same. We also see just how far Kim has fallen, when she threatens to turn in the Kettlemans if they don't do exactly what she wants. When this episode first aired, people really thought the car at the end was Lalo's for some reason. Number 50. Dedicado a Max. Mike's storyline for the first half of Season 5 was basically just to get him and Gus back to where they were in Season 4, and this episode is the conclusion of that, with Gus appealing to Mike's Sigma revenge grind set. I think this plot is probably the least interesting of all the Mike stuff in the show, but it's not terrible or anything. Thankfully, the Jimmy Kim plot is really good this episode, with Saul pulling endless tricks to stop Aka's home from being bulldozed. My favourite is probably when he makes it look like the house is right next to an archaeological dig site. Kim does a Kevin Wachtel impression, and we get the return of Trevor, now with a sexy beard. Seeing Kim get angry at Rich for being right about her throwing the Aka case is annoying, but this is a big season for Kim, so I'll let it slide. And as the title of the episode suggests, we get even more evidence of Gus being gay for Max. Number 49. Axe and Grind. This one is a lot like Sabrosito, where it's all about setting up an epic mid-season showdown type episode. Season 6 was giving hints of Howard's personal life, like his therapy session and hit and run, and here we finally get to meet his wife Cheryl, and it's immediately obvious that they don't exactly have the best relationship. Her dumping his perfectly made coffee into her travel mug may be the single saddest moment in the entire show. Getting to see how shitty Howard's life seems is obvious setup for next episode, and let's just say it's all downhill from here for him. Jimmy and Kim visit Caldera for some drugs, and we get a reference to the vacuum guy, which thankfully doesn't go any further than this one shot of a business card. This is also the last time we see Caldera, which is sad. Lalo's antics in Germany continue from last episode, and this scene of him versus Casper is pretty crazy, except for the fact that it's so fucking dark you can't even see anything. We also finally get an idea of what Jimmy and Kim's grand plan is, and the broken arm reveal at the end of the episode is one of the funniest moments of the season. Imagine if this was a mid-season finale instead of plan and execution though, that cliffhanger would just be terrible. Number 48. Black and Blue. It was hard to decide if I like Axe and Grind or this episode more, and I ended up with this one because of two main reasons. Howard and Jimmy's boxing match, which was so bad that it was good, and the return of Lalo after being MIA for 4 episodes. This episode has some more setup for future conflicts, with Gus planting his gun down at the lab, which made it extremely obvious what was eventually going to happen down there. Francesca makes her return to start working at Saul's new office, and Kim doesn't let Jimmy in on the fact that Lalo was still alive. Lalo being in Germany was an awesome moment because so many people predicted that's where he was, but it just didn't seem fully believable until the moment it actually happened. Him sneaking around Marguerite's house was another really suspenseful moment, because it really felt like someone could get whacked at any second. I can definitely see why Werner was so desperate to see her now. Number 47. 5-0. Yes, I know. This is a lot of people's favourite episode, or at least top 10 or top 5. But personally, I've always vastly preferred the Jimmy McGill storyline of the show over Mike's story, even at its peak. Not saying Mike's scenes are bad or anything, but when it comes to his character, I'm way more invested in the wacky shenanigans he gets up to, more than his backstory. There isn't really anything wrong with this episode, and obviously Jonathan Banks does a good job acting, and I do like when Jimmy spills the coffee on this guy, but it's just not what I personally watch the show for. Number 46. Alpine Shepherd Boy. This is what I watch the show for. The sex toilet scene is hands down the best scene in the entire series, maybe in all of TV history. Dumb people like to call this the worst episode of the show for some reason, which I find bizarre because not only does it have the sex toilet and the guy who prints his own currency, but there's also the major reveal / confirmation that Chuck's EHS is all in his mind. Still don't know why we needed a theory video for something that was confirmed in the 5th episode, but whatever. Jimmy begins his foray into elder law by donning a white suit and advertising at the bottom of Jell-O cups. All that plus a healthy dose of foreshadowing makes this one of the more memorable Season 1 episodes.
Coleman lanterns indoors, a camp stove. He could burn his house down, or the entire neighborhood, and then you're looking at a commitment of 10 to 20 years.
Number 45. Mabel. This is another episode that people give a lot of shit for nothing happening. Mainly the scene where Mike takes his car apart for 56 hours. But for me, that scene is one of my favourite Mike moments in the whole show, and is a perfect example of the series' attention to detail, and letting the audience soak in the vibes of a car being taken apart piece by piece. You could say the whole mystery of who was trailing Mike is made kind of pointless by the fact that it was already pretty obvious who it was at the end of Season 2, but it's still entertaining watching Mike try to figure it out. It's nice to see Jimmy and Chuck connect for a fleeting moment before Chuck brings us back to reality, and his manipulation of Ernesto and then promptly firing him shows just how much of an arsehole he can be. A great intro to the best season of the show. Number 44. Quite a Ride. Dropping a random Breaking Bad scene in a completely unrelated episode that sets up something that doesn't pay off until 2.5 seasons later was definitely unexpected, and it makes this episode stand out among the other early season 4 ones. I always thought that the lawyer Saul refers Francesca to would end up being Howard, but that did not end up happening. This episode is the beginning of a Superlab plot, which some say is boring, but I think it's the best plot Mike had in the whole show. I do find it a bit odd that they never showed the lab being finished, but I guess it wasn't really relevant to the plot by that point. Gus is an idiot for showing his face to Werner right out of the gate, and considering how careful Gus is, it's weird that he even showed his face like ever to him. Jimmy's cell phone side biz kicks off, and he shows off just how drippy he can be. Kim works her ass off for a boneheaded PD client. I wonder how he's doing these days. Howard cries about how terrible his life is, but Jimmy does not care. Number 43. Bingo. This episode is the Kettleman's swan song until their triumphant return in season 6, and boy do they go out with a bang. Mike does some classic Mike sneaking around shenanigans, and eats a bunch of apples. Jimmy and Mike doing random favors for each other was one of my favorite aspects of the early seasons of the show, so it's a shame that they kinda stopped doing that from season 4 onwards, although it obviously makes sense plot-wise. Jimmy's moral dilemma over doing the right thing versus getting a big stack of cash is put to the test here, and even Mike seems confused by his decision. We also get to see Jimmy doing what he does best, being a bingo announcer for elderly people. Maybe he should have done this as a career instead of a whole lawyer thing from the start. The Kettlemans finally getting their comeuppance is one of the most satisfying moments of the show, although it's not so satisfying for Jimmy, leading to him having a gamer rage in the office he can no longer afford. Number 42. Expenses. I'm a big fan of Jimmy filming wacky videos of his film crew, and this episode is one of my favourite scenes with him. After Jimmy agrees to film the advert for these assholes for free, he pays the crew and has no money left for himself. And because she's the best character, Drama Girl offers to give the money back to him because she can tell Jimmy is a broke bitch. This episode also features the return of the actual best character, Daniel Wormold, aka Price, who Nacho uses in his grand plan to get rid of Hector. Mike does some concrete work and hits it off with his chick Anita. Jimmy tries to get his malpractice insurance refunded, and starts crying about how much of a screw-up Chuck is, which ends up indirectly leading to Chuck's death, which Jimmy doesn't acknowledge until the final episode of the entire series. I don't think I need to comment on Odenkirk's acting, because it's obviously amazing, and everyone knows that unless you're the Emmys, I guess. Number 41. Hero. Right after Jimmy's bushwalking adventure in the previous episode, Betsy convinces Jimmy to not talk about the stolen money he found by bribing him, and of course he accepts because he's Jimmy. After that we get one of my favourite Jimmy scams, where he gets a billboard put up that may or may not resemble HHM's branding. We get the introduction of 2/3 of the film crew this episode, who Jimmy uses to film him heroically saving a guy who falls while taking the billboard down, but of course we know that he actually orchestrated it. This scene where Jimmy and Howard argue over the validity of Jimmy's advertising is great, especially the Ham-Lindigo Blue trademark. I love when Kim calls Jimmy and listens through his entire stupid voicemail before asking him out to see the thing. And lastly, Chuck's mission to get the newspaper from across the street is truly iconic. Number 40. Amarillo. This episode is when the cracks begin to form in both Jimmy's job at Davis & Maine and his relationship with Kim. Jimmy films an advert for Davis & Maine and airs it without Cliff's permission, which of course blows up in his face despite it working, and hides the chicanery from Kim. Stacy thinks she hears gunshots at night, so Mike stays up all night to find out whoever's doing it, and there's nothing. Even still, Stacy is adamant that there were gunshots, so Mike decides to move her out of the neighborhood. Some have said Stacy is taking advantage of Mike in these scenes, but I never saw it that way. She was probably just paranoid from Maddie's death. So now Mike needs more money to pay for a new house, so Caldera hooks him up with Nacho for a Tuco side plot. Jimmy wears a big hat and looks dapper. Number 39. Smoke. Chuck is dead, and this episode is dedicated to dealing with that, as well as the rest of the season. Chuck's house looks pretty epic when it's burnt to a crisp, and his funeral is pretty lame as expected. This is one of the most depressing episodes for Howard outside of, where he confesses to Jimmy and Kim that Chuck's death is all of his fault, or at least that's what he thinks. Jimmy's response might be one of his darkest moments, and really sets the stage for his storyline this season. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have wacky Mike security consultant shenanigans. Equally good in its own way, of course, but definitely makes the overall tone of the episode a bit wacky. Meanwhile, Nacho is in hot water after his sugar pills take out Hector, but Gus is onto him, beginning the endless cycle of Nacho taking L after L until his eventual end. Number 38. Off-brand. Jimmy is now suspended from being a lawyer for the next year, so he has to find other ways to earn money to pay rent. He runs around with his crew trying to find a business to film an advert for, until Drama Girl says he should film an ad for himself, which leads to the greatest work of art ever put to film. Jimmy also finally starts using the name Saul Goodman in some capacity, and we get this iconic line.
It's just a name.
Meanwhile, Nacho tries to prove to Hector that he's an alpha male, Gus has a date with Lydia, and Chuck goes shopping. The best scene in the episode is probably this one for certain reasons. Number 37. Something Beautiful. This episode has the most famous action scene in the Breaking Bad universe, the Hummel heist, ending with a beta cuck chasing his runaway car after Jimmy hijacks it. The scene where Jimmy tries to convince Mike to do the heist would feel like a classic early season scene if it weren't for the fact that Chuck's death is still fresh in everyone's mind, which comes back at the end of the episode with a letter. It can be hard to decipher what Chuck's intentions were, but the important part of the scene isn't the letter itself but Jimmy's reaction, or more so the lack of one. Kim's reaction to it is pretty much the exact opposite, and goddamn Ray Seahorn is a good actress. Meanwhile, Nacho is having the worst day of his life after being shot by Victor and Tyrus for Gus's little scheme, and they get way too much enjoyment out of this. Thankfully, Caldera comes in clutch like always. Kim has too much boring Mesa Verde work, so she hires Viola to help her. And most importantly, we get the return of local sex offender Gale, who tries to impress Gus with his chemistry skills. Number 36. Pinata. This episode has the grand return of Chuck, so already it's the best episode of Season 4 so far. This is also the last time we see Jimmy, Kim, Chuck and Howard on screen together, back in HHM before things went to shit, and we see the moment Jimmy decides to become a lawyer apparently. Mike and Gus work on setting up for the Germans, and I really like their dynamic here. Mike knows that normal people need entertainment so they don't go crazy, but Gus is a robot who doesn't understand what emotions are, so there's like a fun dynamic going on there. Well, he does have one emotion actually, revenge. As seen later in the episode, where he visits Hector in the hospital to tell him a story about a tree in a Kawati, which obviously parallels his situation with Hector. Some people theorized that this speech was foreshadowing what Gus would end up doing to Lalo, but that turned out to not be the case, mostly. This scene is good for catching up people on how dedicated Gus is to his trolling if they can't remember all the details from Breaking Bad. Jimmy expands his cell phone business and gets revenge on those hooligans who mugged him. The best scene of the episode is when Jimmy goes to collect his $5,000 check from Howard, who is still sulking around like a baby. Jimmy tries to motivate Howard, and although it seems like he doesn't appreciate the advice, we see in Season 5 that he did end up taking it to heart. Hopefully Season 4 is the last of Howard's troubles. Number 35. Nippy. This was perhaps the most controversial episode of the entire show when it first released, and while I would love to talk about my thoughts on it, I think it would be best if we heard from an expert on the subject. So without further ado, here is Johnny Cooper 64.
Hello everyone, Johnny Cooper here. HN Films has been recasted and replaced by yours truly, so this is who you have to deal with now, whether you like it or not. As the Better Call Saul prequel era of the show came to a close during the episode of Fun and Games, many fans were at the edge of their seats as they teased the Breaking Bad era at the end of the episode, giving them hope that the next few episodes will be set in Breaking Bad from Jimmy's point of view. However, that wasn't the case and the episode received a massive backlash. Nippy marks the turning point of the show, as the following episodes are in black and white and take place way after Better Call Saul and just right after Breaking Bad and El Camino, with only the flashbacks being in color to represent the Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad era. All those years of the black and white buildup has come to this point. The episode starts with a new character introduced, Marion, whom Gene befriends, now breaking out of his depressing persona and going back to the Saul Goodman ways for one last ride. We cut to the intro that plays during the 10th episode, but this time the tape stops playing as we embark into unknown territory, where we then see Jeff driving, but wait a minute, this ain't Don Harvey. Harvey gave an awesome performance in Magic Man's opening. The actor had this unique face to him that fit the unknowingly vibe of the Gene scenes, and the way he taunted Gene screamed final boss. Cause before this episode, Gene is all alone and vulnerable, and here comes this mysterious creepy guy who finds out who he is, and we're only left wondering what this guy's endgame is. Is he a detective, a cop, cartel member, or someone with a personal grudge, and it all led to just whatever we got in Nippy. I checked YouTube comments and internet forums to see if maybe I was the only one who hyped this guy up too much, and thankfully I wasn't. People peered out their disappointment after Nippy aired on Jeff, with many saying that they retconned this character's personality. So, what happened? Sadly, due to COVID delaying filming for Better Call Saul, Don Harvey was unable to reprise his role as Jeff as he already signed a contract to star in an HBO series, making Jeff the first character in the Breaking Bad universe to get recasted, which was a shame considering they were right at the finish line. So we got Pat Healy to play the character's role for the major part of the final season. Sadly, I wasn't able to be immersed into the episode because of how distracting the recast was. But not only was the acting of Jeff different, which will have been inevitable, but he felt like a completely new character, as if he was rewritten to fit Pat Healy. This was debunked in a podcast as they confirmed that the script was already finished before they got the news that Don Harvey won't be able to return. They also confirmed that they don't plan out these storylines and just swing it as they go along with each season. This show and Breaking Bad have been near perfect, but this is the only thing that I can say that they completely fucked up and had no idea what to do with Jeff after establishing him as a menacing antagonist for 2 seasons. It looked like they had 2 directions to go for the final episodes, a cat and mouse game between Gene and Jeff, or make it more character study focus, and they ultimately chose to go with the second choice, which didn't fit what they've written Jeff previously. So now he's a new character that's this man-child goofball who's a noob at crime, which fits perfectly for this stupid fucking episode. Not only did they change what was previously established for Jeff, but also what was previously done for the Gene openings. We no longer get the pressing Kino filled with fear and constant paranoia, but instead a funny episode that felt like something straight out of the newer MCU movies. I know this sounds like an exaggeration, but this felt like a betrayal. Nippy is directed in a comedic fashion, which you can tell by the character's dialogue, music choice, and the cliche tropes, which is weird because the other Gene episodes aren't like this. But yeah, the episode is just Gene finding out Jeff's mom and flipping the tables on Jeff. He has no actual leverage since he can just call the popo and have this man arrested ASAP, while also getting like a $4 million award for Saul's arrest. But no, what Jeff really wants is to get in the game. We all know Don Harvey Jeff will have just beaten the fuck out of Saul Goodman right there. Jeff then teams up with Gene and they bring alongside his tall friend too, which they didn't recast thankfully. The trio, which consists of Gene, Jeff, and Tall Jeff, do the heist. The heist itself was not interesting, but hey, the Heisenberg reference was pretty cool, am I right? Overall, I didn't like the direction they went with Jeff's character and the story for the episode. It was just too out of place, generic, and boring. It already felt like a Marvel movie, so might as well have embraced it and give us the Gene versus Jeff Kino fight that we've been waiting to see. The snow aesthetic, black and white filter, and the obese security guy's actor, who I know him as Jerry from Parks and Rec, were the only saving grace for this episode in my opinion. If it weren't for these 3 things, then this episode will have been like the worst in the series and possibly like in the entire Breaking Bad universe.
Damn, dude fucking hates this episode, Jesus. As for my thoughts on the episode, I do really like it, but I don't think it's an all-time great episode like some people seem to think. Definitely a fun one to discuss with people though. Number 34. Switch. This episode is so important for Jimmy and Kim's relationship. It's the one that introduces us to Kim's alter ego Slip and Kimmy, and how her and Jimmy bond over scamming people. Always good to see Ken Wynn's take an L. This episode really shows that Kim and Jimmy are perfect for each other, considering they made up their scam on the fly and it works perfectly. Of course, the real star of the show is Price, now driving a school bus for 6-year-old pimps, but Mike doesn't approve. The ending of the episode is especially great, where it looks like Jimmy has gotten everything he could possibly want, including the Coco Bolo desk, until we see the switch that says not to be flipped. Jimmy flips it anyway because of course he does, implying his career at Davis and Maine might not go as smoothly as expected. Number 33. Magic Man. While I have given the first half of Season 5 a lot of shit in the past, I do think the first episode is a great starting point for the season. We finally get to see what we've been waiting for since the show started, which is Jimmy in full-on Saul Goodman mode, doing what he does best. The best scene here is when he and the camera crew ambush Bill Oakley to very subtly advertise for Saul. Kim works with another idiot client who's too busy playing Super Mario Land 2 on his Game Boy to pay attention to the deal she's managed to get him, and when Jimmy proposes some chicanery to get him to take the deal, she isn't impressed. She ends up doing it anyway, which plants the seeds for her further descent into slipping Kimmy this season. Meanwhile, Mike's in a bad mood after murdering Werner, and takes it out on Kai for some reason. Lalo's still on the hunt for Werner Ziegler, and is clearly not impressed by Gus's cover story of building a chicken chiller instead of a mother of all meth labs. This episode also has the best Gene opening of a show by far, with him being harassed by Jeff and trying to run away, before deciding to deal with it himself instead. This is also the last scene with Robert Forster, aka the vacuum guy, since he died 1 second after filming. Number 32. Wine and Roses. Now this is how you start a season. The cold open of this episode is hands down my favourite in the whole show. The very first shot with the grey ties making us think it's more Gene shenanigans until other colours start floating in is just one example of how amazingly the show is filmed. We finally get to see where Saul was living during Breaking Bad, and of course it's the most cartoonishly over-the-top mansion you could possibly think of, complete with golden toilet, which may or may not be the sex toilet. What really ties the scene together is the music, which somehow perfectly captures that feeling of this being the beginning of the end. As for the rest of the episode, this is the start of a 3-part Nacho saga, while Jimmy and Kim shenanigans take a bit of a backseat, which I think was a smart move, because after the end of Season 5, I was most looking forward to how Nacho and Lalo's plots would go down, much more than Jimmy and Kim's trolling of Howard. Lalo shows just how prepared he is for any situation, by having this guy around just to kill and use as a body double on the off chance he ever has to fake his death. Funnily enough, this does end up being beneficial to Gus in the end, since Hector can't prove that Lalo was alive since he faked his death so well. The cousins show up to do nothing as usual. Kim is eager to get a move on with the Howard plot, but Jimmy is apprehensive. Unfortunately, his horniness gets the better of him, and he goes to Kevin's country club to make a scene about how Kevin is a Nazi, which he probably is. And we get to see Saul's ass, which is a big bonus. And lastly, Lalo calls up Hector for some advice, who says he needs to find proof. First time watching, I was sure the proof would be Nacho, but unfortunately those two would never come face to face again. Bit of a missed opportunity in my opinion, but whatever. It wouldn't really fit the story they were trying to tell anyway. Number 31. Fall. This is without a doubt the lowest Jimmy has ever gone, when he uses Irene as a tool to try and force the Sandpiper settlement so he can earn a cool mill off it. The scenes of Jimmy manipulating everyone into hating Irene is just depressing to watch, and there's really no way to justify it at all. He just did it to be an asshole. At least Irene got some new shoes out of it. Meanwhile, Kim is under a lot of pressure from work when she decides to bring on Hank from Twin Peaks as a second client alongside Mesa Verde, which ends up overworking her until she falls asleep at the wheel and... There's a great Jimmy and Howard scene where Jimmy confronts Howard about the Sandpiper case, but ends up being called out for being the greedy man-child he really is. Hector has a pissy fit over Gus's drug distribution being better than his, and it looks like Nacho's sugar pills are about to knock him out, but it doesn't work. Nacho gives up and confesses to his daddy about how much of a loser he is, and he gets kicked out. Mike meets Lydia, and the sexual tension is immense. Howard and Chuck's relationship starts falling apart after Chuck's EHS delusions are made public, and Howard tries to get him to retire. Chuck isn't having it though, and decides he would rather take down his own firm than leave it. He failed, but eventually he did end up getting what he wanted. Number 30. Something Unforgivable. This is another episode that I gave a bit of shit when it came out, but looking back it's actually a really solid season finale, mainly for the cartel side of the plot. Nacho was working to get Lalo's trust throughout this whole season, and you can see that Lalo really valued him at this point, which makes it all the worse when he realizes he betrayed him. Nacho meeting Eladio is cool, and Nacho manages to impress him with his drip and guns. The main point of contention with this episode is the shootout at Lalo's house, which almost borders on comically stupid, but I think having a wacky shootout at the end of the episode was the right move, and it's always good seeing Lalo be an unstoppable force of nature against the worst hitmen in the country. The look on his face when he realizes Nacho let the hitmen in sets up a really exciting confrontation between the two in the final season, which didn't end up happening. Jimmy and Kim's side of the story is a lot less action-packed, but still has some good moments, like when Jimmy harasses Mike for info on the Lalo plot. Slip and Kimmy is truly born in this episode, when she laughs in Howard's face after he tells her about Jimmy's chicanery, and then sets in motion the plan to ruin him, which leads to everything else being ruined. Number 29. Videsen. Jimmy and Kim's argument in this episode is one of their best scenes, when they finally let out their pent-up emotions that were building up throughout the whole season. Jimmy cries like a baby about how Kim won't get an office with him, and Kim lays down the truth for him, with her last line being one of the best in the series.
Jimmy, you are always down.
Meanwhile, Werner is complaining about how he misses fucking his hot wife, but Mike can't sympathize since he hasn't fucked in 57 years. So Werner lets his horniness make the decisions for him and runs off. Lalo, who was introduced at the end of a previous episode, visits Hector to give him the bell he has in Breaking Bad, and then goes to begin his trolling of Gus at Pollo's. Jimmy's meeting to get his law license reinstated goes well at first until he doesn't mention Chuck, and he has a gamer rage outside on the staircase. Number 28. Nailed. This episode is the fallout of Jimmy's address swapping of 1261 to 1216 from the previous episode, which sees Chuck getting riled up in court at the prospect of being wrong about something, which leads to Mesa Verde's expansion plans being delayed by 6 weeks. Of course, he immediately knows it's Jimmy who was behind the chicanery, and lays out a practically beat-for-beat accurate guess of what happened to Kim. Kim does side with Jimmy, but it turns out that she knew it was him all along. Chuck decides to do some detective work, but Jimmy pays off the copy shop guy not to rat him out. Chuck cries like a baby, then hits his head and dies. On the Mike side of the story, he continues his trolling of Hector, which leads to a Good Samaritan being murdered by Salamanca goons, which obviously goes against Mike's code of conduct when it comes to random people becoming collateral damage from people in the game. Jimmy and Kim move into and start working at their new Wexler McGill office, which was always my favourite of all of Jimmy's workplaces throughout the show. There's some pretty iconic shots in this episode, and of course the best part is Jimmy singing the Pina Colada song.
If you like pina coladas, getting caught in the rain, if you're not into yoga, and you got half a brain.
Number 27. Click. The finale of Season 2 is equally exciting from both the Mike and Jimmy sides of the story, with Mike setting out to get rid of Hector once and for all, which culminates in a scene that's super tense even though we obviously know both Mike and Hector are in Breaking Bad. The reveal of the note on Mike's car was a super exciting moment the first time watching, since it was basically confirmation that Gus was getting in on the action, which some people had already figured out based on rearranging the first letters in each of Season 2's episode titles. Meanwhile, Jimmy has to deal with Chuck's death at the end of a previous episode, and although Chuck immediately sees through him, Ernesto comes in clutch to save Jimmy. No one in this entire show ever appreciates Ernesto, which is a real shame. We also get a pretty depressing, although very important, cold open, where Jimmy and Chuck's mother dies while cucking Chuck one final time. The highlight of this episode is of course the ending, when Jimmy confesses to Chuck that he did indeed swap the addresses exactly like how Chuck accused him. Bob Odenkirk's acting here is amazing.
And I thought you'd just say, oh crap, I made a mistake, and go on with your life like a normal person. But oh no, wishful thinking!
The reveal that Chuck played Jimmy like a fiddle is the best cliffhanger of the show, possibly, and really pushes Chuck into the full-on villain role that he has in the first half of Season 3. Number 26. Something Stupid. This episode has the most iconic montage of the show, with the split screen and that amazing song in the background, which is so good I never skip it when it shows up in my Spotify playlist. A big time skip like this was pretty much necessary to get to where things are by the end of the season, and they could not have done it in a better way, by both showing the length of time and how Jimmy and Kim are becoming more distant. The time skip also allows us to get into some more fun stuff, like Hector's journey back to being a cunt. This scene where Jimmy kinda embarrasses Kim at the S&C party is funny as hell, and Huell clocking this guy with a sandwich bag sets up the greatest subplot of all time. Kim and Jimmy butt heads again over how to handle things, with Jimmy wanting to do his usual chicanery, and Kim wanting to play it straight, at least until Suzanne Erickson offends her. Gus realizes that he can use his veto power to troll Hector forever, and I'm still not entirely clear on how Gus has the power to make these decisions without the Salamancas getting a say. We get to see the Super Lab starting to take shape, although it never gets much further than this state for a long time. I do find it a bit weird that so much of the season is dedicated to building the Super Lab, and we never get to see the fruits of their labor in this show at least, but I guess it didn't really matter at the end. Number 25. Waterworks. The penultimate episode of the final season features the return of Kim, after being gone from the last 2 episodes, now with a new haircut. For the most part, this is like a solo Kim episode, showing her less than exciting life in Florida, complete with her new beta cuck boyfriend who can't even buy mayonnaise. Her going back to Albuquerque to confess her involvement in Howard's murder was just crazy to see the first time watching. and it shows that she took her advice to Gene to heart about turning himself in. It's cool that Cheryl stuck around for more than just 2 scenes in the season, and her reaction to Kim's confession is pretty depressing. In fact, this whole episode is just depressing. Gene is still on his tirade against Cancer Guy, and almost fucking murders him with a pot of his dead dog's ashes. Jesus. And this isn't even the only time he comes close to murdering someone in this episode. This is also the last we see of Jeff, which I think is just hilarious that we never find out what happened to him. Not a complaint at all, like genuinely a great decision on the writer's part. He's like Huel 2.0, which I'm sure I may be the very first person to point out. In between all this, we get scenes showing Saul and Kim's official divorce. And of course, Kim meets Jesse, which is pretty pointless, but probably the best of the Walt/Jesse fan service scenes. Aaron Paul did as good a job as he possibly could here, and he looked really good considering how old he is now compared to how old Jesse is supposed to be in this scene. This is like pre-Breaking Bad. The dialogue once again did feel kinda off, but not like terrible or anything. The ending with Gene finally being exposed is an all-time great BCS moment, with the colour of a Saul advert reflecting in his glasses, which is a callback to the very first episode of the show. I don't think he would have actually murdered Marion, but it was still chilling to see how far he's fallen. And of course, him getting busted by an elderly person is just delicious irony from his elder law days. The best part of the episode is obviously Gene singing though. We've now reached the point where the episodes start getting like insanely good, like pretty much everyone from here is a 10 out of 10, so you can look at this as one massive number 1 if you want to, because the placements really don't matter at all at this point, except for like the last like 5 to 10. Anyway, continuing on. Number 24. Inflatable. This episode is possibly the most important flashback for Jimmy's character, where a random guy taking advantage of his dad's generosity gives young Jimmy some advice. This pretty much leads to all the bad things Jimmy ever does after this, so bravo to this one guy for ruining everything for everyone ever. But the real star of this episode is everything to do with Jimmy's storyline, where he finally decides to quit his job at Davis & Maine until he finds out he won't get to keep a bonus in his contract unless he is fired. And so we get another one of the best montages in the show. I feel like I say that about every montage, they're all so good. Jimmy's antics to get himself fired are of course hilarious, and Cliff's last words to him are the icing on the cake.
For what it's worth, I think you're a good guy.
For what it's worth, I think you're an asshole.
He even gets to keep the Coco Bolo desk, so everything works out in the end. And then we get Jimmy's passionate speech to Kim about starting a law firm together so they can be their own bosses. And while she does turn him down, she comes back with an even better offer at the end of the episode. And this scene of Jimmy sending his new voicemail message is also great. And we get a cameo from a film crew, so of course this episode is a 10 out of 10. Number 23. Gloves Off. The Mike side of this episode revolves around him and Nacho planning how to deal with Tuco, with Mike offering to snipe him dead. We get the return of the arms dealer guy Lawson from Breaking Bad, and I really like watching him and Mike talk guns. They're a great duo. I wish we had more scenes of them. Mike ends up deciding to get Tuco a different way, which involves trolling him until the cops arrive. I'm a big fan of the random shenanigans Mike gets up to this season, and this is one of the best examples of it. This is the last we see of Tuco in this show, which is a shame because I was really hoping for a Tuco-Lalo scene in season 6, just because those two are kind of polar opposites while still being related. What really makes this episode a standout for me though is the Jimmy plot, which is the fallout of him airing his Davis & Maine advert without Cliff's permission. It's one of the best examples of Jimmy's thought process, as shown in both his meeting with the partners and also his conversation with Chuck, where he makes it clear that the results matter more than if he has to bend the rules to get to said results. That Chuck and Jimmy scene, by the way, one of the best scenes between the two in the whole show, with Chuck at both his most asshole-ish, but also most understandable, when he talks about how Jimmy put Kim at risk for his own benefit.
You have to admit this shows a lack of judgment on her part. She knows you. She should have known better.
You are such an asshole.
Why? For pointing out that her one mistake was believing in you?
Jimmy trying to get Chuck to extort him is also a good example of no matter how much Chuck wants to end Jimmy's antics, his adherence to the law trumps everything else. And Ona Kirk obviously does an amazing job acting, as always.
Oh, come on. You can't be pissed off at her about this.
I'm not. Howard is.
Howard is probably at his most villainous at this point in the show, where he sends Kim to the cornfields as a result of Jimmy's chicanery. But like Chuck, his thought process is totally understandable. There's really no true villains in this show, at least not until Lalo arrives. Number 22. Nacho. This episode is where the show really gets going. In the first episode, Kim had 2 lines of dialogue, and in the second episode she had like 1 shot of her, which is really weird looking back, but in this episode we get our proper introduction to her and Jimmy's relationship, which is pretty much summed up perfectly in this first scene where he calls her at 2 AM, and she immediately assumes he wants to do phone sex. We also get to see Jimmy and Mike's dynamic start to develop, when Mike gives him some advice on how to find the missing Kettlemans. Nacho is super intimidating here, which is kind of weird to see after seeing how his story unfolds throughout the rest of the show. After this plotline, he and Jimmy don't even interact again until season 5. Jimmy's attempt to anonymously warn the Kettlemans about Nacho is hilarious, especially when he just gives up his funny voice and just shouts into the phone instead. This episode as a whole is just really amusing, like when Jimmy tells Kim about his warning later on, and she straight away deduces that he used the sex robot voice.
Oh God, you didn't do the sex robot voice, did you?
I did. The tube and the whole thing.
Which I don't even want to know how that comes up in their relationship normally. The cold open introduces us to the hilariously bad young Jimmy wig, which I will still take any day over CGI de-aging or any of that shit. We get our first mention of a Chicago sunroof, which obviously comes back in a big way in the season finale. Capping off the episode is a sublime montage of Jimmy adventuring out into the woods to find the Kettlemans, with a very fitting song to accompany it. Song choices for montages is something that the show never fails to impress on. Number 21. Fifi. This episode is one of the coolest cold opens of the series, showing border security searching trucks for drugs and whatnot. It's mostly filmed in one long take, and the music is some of Dave Porter's best work. The rest of the episode is kind of like a battle for Mesa Verde between Wexler McGill and HHM. When Kim gives her resignation to Howard, he seems pretty proud of her and expresses some level of regret for not doing his own thing instead of letting his dad convince him to jump on the HHM train. I really love these moments of characters putting aside their beef with each other to be genuine for a moment. And it reminds me of a similar scene in season 1, when Jimmy and Howard sort of reconcile after Chuck's peak-headedness is revealed. Obviously this moment of wholesomeness is cut short when Kim leaves Howard's office and overhears him already making a move on Mesa Verde. She manages to secure them for her own practice, but Chuck has to ruin it by getting them back on Team HHM by saying Kim isn't experienced enough. When Jimmy gets wind of this, he goes ahead and does perhaps his smartest scheme ever, swapping the address of a planned Mesa Verde branch from 1261 to 1216, which of course sets in motion all the conflicts for season 3. The show does such a good job at making pretty mundane work look super exciting, and this is no exception. Mike doesn't do much of importance this episode, but watching Mike do nothing is still a great TV experience. Jimbo also shoots another wacky commercial with his crew, this time with a guy Jimmy once defended for public masturbation. It really seems like Albuquerque has a problem with that. Number 20. Miho. The second episode of the show kicks things into high gear straight away, with Jimmy thrown into the desert to negotiate with the least negotiable person in Albuquerque. This scene takes up like half the episode and goes to show just how good at his job Jimmy can be, and that he actually has a moral compass, since he didn't leave the skateboard kids to get turned into meat piñatas by Tuco. We also get to meet Nacho, who at this stage is a far cry from what he becomes later down the road. We also get some more insight into Chuck's peculiar disease, when he has to wrap himself in a space blanket when he thinks Jimmy's up to his usual hijinks. We're also introduced to the first of many montages in the show, showing Jimmy doing his shitty PD work and his back and forth with Mike with stickers, and we see Kim for a whopping 2 shots in the entire episode. Number 19. Bagman. This is the big, epic action set piece of basically the whole show, and I think this might be Vince Gilligan's best work from a directing standpoint. Obviously, we aren't going to be fearing for Jimmy or Mike's lives during any of this unless you don't know Breaking Bad exists. But even so, the shootout is filmed so well that I don't really care. The cinematography throughout this episode and the whole season is just on point, with some pretty inspired shots. Kim meeting Lalo is something that none of us wanted to see, and it's suitably ominous. This episode also features the most tragic death in the entire series, the Suzuki Esteem. May it rest in peace. One of my minor complaints of the show after season 2 was that Mike and Jimmy didn't get together for some misadventures nearly as much as I would have liked. So to get an entire episode of just them walking around the desert was exactly what I wanted. We get to see Mike give Saul some motivation by talking about why he does what he does, although it is a shame that in the end he dies for nothing and leaves his family nothing. Jimmy refusing to use the space blanket is a smart way of showing that Chuck's memory is still looming over him 24/7, no matter how much he tries to ignore it. And the last sequence of Mike sniping the car is once again super well made, topped off with Jimmy drinking his own piss. I don't think this is the best episode of all time like some people seem to, but it's undeniable how good it is, even if it isn't exactly the usual BCS jig. Number 18. Rico. This episode might just be my pick for the most underrated episode in the whole show. It's the start of a Sandpiper case, which is when the show goes from really, really good to insanely good. The cold open is easily the best one to analyze on rewatch, since it's so easy to tell Chuck's true feelings on Jimmy passing the bar, with the knowledge of what he says in Pimento.
Is this a joke?
No, no joke.
Wow. I don't know what to say.
Are you proud of me?
Oh,
Consider hiring me.
As what? Oh, a lawyer, obviously. Yeah.
And we see the beginnings of Chuck using Howard as the scapegoat for Jimmy to blame for not hiring him at HHM. The main plot of the episode is the discovery of Sandpiper taking advantage of their elderly clients, which leads to the one time in the entire show that Chuck and Jimmy work together on a case. It's nice to see Jimmy being so excited about seemingly getting what he's always wanted, to be an equal alongside his brother, which makes what happens next episode all the more tragic. Jimmy writing his demand letter on the toilet paper and later dumpster diving for shredded documents are both comedy gold, especially when Rich calls Jimbo while he's in the trash.
Enjoy the magic flute.
Blow my magic flute.
Rich is another one of those goated side characters who we really did not get enough of in the show. Just a class act all around. And he has by far the swankiest law firm in Albuquerque. He tries to intimidate Jimmy and Chuck and throws them a lowball offer, but Chuck isn't having any of it. Meanwhile, Stacy not so subtly nudges Mike towards getting her more money for expenses, so he visits Caldera to get some less than official work. The stinger at the end of Chuck casually going outside to grab a box of documents is an intriguing development, and rounds out what I would call a practically perfect episode. Number 17. Rock and Hard Place. This is Nacho's grand finale, only 3 episodes into season 6. I guess this season didn't really have time for Nacho, so the writers had to deal with him as early on as possible. I was practically certain that Nacho and Lalo would have some sort of confrontation this season, and while that didn't happen, I still think this is probably as good an ending he possibly could have gotten. The twins once again continue being idiots, so Nacho manages to get away from them. His last conversation with his daddy is just painful to watch, with Nacho knowing this is the last time he'll ever hear his voice. It is good to see him actually have the upper hand on Gus for once, since he's basically been taking L after L since season 4. We can also see how far Mike has fallen from grace, since Gus is pretty much directly responsible for Nacho's death, but Mike just keeps working for him anyway. In between the grim stuff, we have more of Jimmy and Kim continuing their wacky scheme against Howard, with the return of Huel for his last episode. I really do like this scene of copying Howard's keys, but it all just feels kind of out of place compared to the other stuff going on in this episode. I honestly think they should have just made this all Nacho for the entire episode, kind of like chicanery was for the lawyer plot. Nacho's last scene is everything you could hope for, with him finally expressing his disdain for the Salamancas and Gus. Him revealing he put Hector in that chair is easily the best part. And while it is satisfying to see him sail that before shooting himself, it's still pretty bleak that this guy who was just trying to get out of the game for ages never managed to succeed. This episode honestly just made me hate Mike and Gus even more, even with Mike's promise to protect his father and all that. I'm glad that Mike ended up being killed by a bald beta cuck for no reason. Oh yeah, and the cold open is pretty spectacular. Number 16. Lantern. At the time of release, this was easily the darkest episode of the show, with Chuck's storyline and life coming to a fiery end. The whole season was quietly building to this moment, and seeing Chuck tear his house apart when he was so close to getting better is just painful, even if he was the closest thing the show had to a villain at that point. Jimmy and Chuck's last conversation is just more pain on top of that, with Jimmy wanting to make amends but Chuck being too much of a dickhead to reciprocate. It's pretty obvious that Chuck didn't really mean it when he said Jimmy didn't matter to him, when he's made it apparent throughout the show that he's basically obsessed with him, but the fact that this is the last thing he says to him probably ended up playing a big part in how Jimmy deals with Chuck's death in season 4. And speaking of his death, the final scene of the episode may be the single most haunting moment of the series. It's almost kind of scary watching it, with the destroyed house and silence only interrupted by the sound of him kicking the desk. And this is also the first episode to not use the usual credits theme at the end, which was a pretty necessary choice but just adds to that feeling of witnessing something really messed up. The only halfway decent thing that happens in this episode is Hector getting taken out by Nacho's sugar pills. Or at least he would have if it weren't for Gus intervening because his hate boner is too strong. Gus's sneaky eyes at Nacho may in fact be confirmation of his gayness. On a lighter note, Kim and Francesca go to Blockbuster, and Jimmy manages to fix the hole he dug Irene into, although it doesn't really change the fact that he just destroyed this woman's social life for his own financial gain. Number 15. Uno. I rewatched this episode with some friends who've never seen Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul before, and I was reminded of how amazingly this first episode sets up the show. That first scene after the cold open of everyone waiting around for Jimmy to come in and do his lawyer thing really sets the mood, that this isn't going to be quite as action-packed as Breaking Bad often was. There's some pretty clever camera work in this episode, like when Jimmy is walking towards a car that looks a whole lot like the one in Breaking Bad, but the camera moves to reveal his much less desirable car that he actually drives. I love how the writers don't really outright tell you anything, and assume the audience is smart enough to figure things out for themselves. Like the Cinnabon sequence at the start doesn't have a title card that says 6 months after Breaking Bad or something like that. And Jimmy doesn't make any explicit reference to Chuck being allergic to electricity. You can figure out who this Chuck guy that Jimmy and Howard are talking about is based on the name of a firm if you're paying attention. It all just feels so natural, like we were just dropped into a random day in the life of Jimmy McGill. This is probably a good time to mention how much I love how the show is shot, especially compared to Breaking Bad. In that show, the camera was always handheld, and I'm not really a big fan of shaky cam to begin with, so I didn't really like that. BCS often uses locked off shots and smooth camera moves that just look a whole lot better to me. The different styles do fit each show, and there are times that BCS does use handheld, like in the Gene sequence at the start of the episode. And while I do love the Breaking Bad intro, I do think the Better Call Saul one is more interesting, with how it changes throughout the show. Jimmy's wacky misadventures with the skateboard kids is a good way to introduce us to his scheming side, and of course it blows up spectacularly at the end of the episode, leaving on a cliffhanger that does work if you have no idea who Tuco is, but works even better if you do know. Also, I would totally live in this nail salon, the vibes are just impeccable. Number 14. JMM. This episode has everything you could possibly want. A wedding, a giant explosion, Kim being an alpha, Jimmy in his underwear, sex, Jimmy defending Lalo in court, Kino cinematography, Lydia, Jimmy going psycho mode on Howard, and Huel. The wedding scene might be the last time Kim and Jimmy were truly happy together, and thankfully Huel's there to capture the moment. This scene where Kim and Rich are being chewed out for supposedly screwing up the Acker case, and Kim turns it around on Kevin is super satisfying, and I love how Rich just goes along with it and doesn't really add anything. Nacho and Gus go on a side mission to blow up some random Pollo's building, and we get our epic badass walking away from explosion scene. I wonder if that explosion was real or not. Like, if anyone knows if it is real or not, just tell me in the comments because I'm really interested. I can't find any info on it anywhere. Gus meets up with Schuler and Lydia for a freeway, and brings up his mysterious Santiago backstory that is introduced in this season and never elaborated on again. This is sadly the last time we will ever see Lydia, thanks to her not being available for season 6. Jimmy and Mike finally have some more screen time together, and Mike gives him some info to help in Gus's convoluted plan to get Lalo out of jail. Jimmy's clearly disturbed by the fact that he's helping this crazy murder man get away with killing a random guy, but he likes money too much to do anything about it, so he decides to take it out on Howard instead, who calls him out for being a meanie head. It's interesting that the first thing Jimmy brings up in his rant is Howard supposedly killing Chuck, which shows that his brother's still on his mind almost 2 seasons after his death. Maybe Jimmy's lightning powers are the reason Chuck always hated him, what with the allergy to electricity and all that. Number 13. Hit and Run. Considering this episode is the one after Nacho's death, Hit and Run has no reason to go as hard as it does. Some pretty major plot things happen this episode, while also bringing back a lot of that season 1 charm that I was missing. We finally get some insight into Howard's personal life, with the mention of a significant other that he isn't on the best terms with. Jimmy enters the scene to do what he does best, impersonating Howard. Wacky shenanigans ensue, and Wendy shows up to assist, thus deconfirming the Kim equals Wendy theory, unfortunately. They even made sure to put Kim and Wendy in the same shot just to make it crystal clear. Cliff is utterly perplexed by all this, which continues his role this season of being utterly perplexed by everything. Jimmy having to eat lunch by himself because no one wants to sit with him thanks to the whole Lalo thing is both funny and sad, especially when even Oakley doesn't want to troll him anymore. Saul has way too many clients at the nail salon, including Spooge himself, so we finally get the introduction of his Breaking Bad office, although a bit more minimalist than usual. This is also the last time we see both the nail salon and Mrs. Nguyen, truly the end of an era. Meanwhile, Kim is paranoid about being followed wherever she goes, and she ends up finally meeting Mike, which was pretty crazy to see the first time watching. He tells her about Lalo being alive but not Saul, because he knows Kim is an alpha girl boss, and Jimmy is a beta crybaby. The cold open of the episode introduces us to Gus Fring's cartoon underground lair, with a tunnel connecting his house to another one next door. I don't know if he already had this set up, or if he somehow put it together after Lalo was revealed to still be alive, but either way it's pretty ridiculous, in a good way. It shows just how much of a paranoid scaredy cat Gus really is when he doesn't have a situation fully under control. This is also the first and last episode to be directed by Ray Seahorn, and she did a pretty spectacular job, I would say. I don't know how much input the director actually has on a show like this, but there's some pretty fancy shots to be found here, with the main attraction being this POV door shot. Bravo, Seahorn. Number 12. Cobbler. The star of this episode is absolutely Daniel Wormold, aka Price. After his extremely valuable baseball cards are stolen, he enlists the cops to find them for him. Mike catches wind of this, gives him a speech about ACAB, and sets out to find the cards himself. Mike obviously knows it was Nacho, and he proposes an idea that will benefit both of them. Price does get the cards back, but at the cost of his prized Hummer, which leads to the best exchange in the whole show.
You think I'd be caught dead driving that thing? Looks like a school bus for 6-year-old pimps.
All right, shall we move this along?
I'm dead serious when I say the Price scenes are some of my favourites in the show, and it's such a missed opportunity that he didn't pop back up for some silly capers after season 3. The conclusion to this baseball cards plot is Mike enlisting Jimmy to get the cops off Price, and he does this by coming up with the most elaborate, insane story I think we've ever seen from him. And of course it works because the cops are stupid. Jimmy gets his iconic travel mug from Kim, and it fits perfectly in his Suzuki, but doesn't fit in his new car. Bit of subtle foreshadowing there, love to see it. For the time being though, Jimmy's doing a-okay at Davis and Maine, until Chuck bursts in to ruin the fun. Curious how Jimmy's acceptance of Mike's morally flexible work is a direct result of Chuck's actions at HHM, once again showing that he brings out the worst in Jimmy. Kim finds out about his light fabrication of evidence and makes it clear she wants nothing to do with it, ending the episode on a less than truthful note. Number 11. Kushata. The quest to free Huell Babineau is hands down the best scheme Jimmy and Kim ever concocted. Every aspect of it is just genius, and the way it's executed is truly a joy to watch. Jimmy takes a bus ride down to Huell's hometown and gets everyone there to write a bunch of letters pretending to be staunch supporters of Huell's rules, which flusters the judge to make Kim and Suzanne Erickson resolve the case without causing a fuss. This leads to Erickson doing some detective work to find out why Huell is so beloved, where we see Jimmy set up a high-tech website showing his accomplishments, and has also set up 1 million phones in the nail salon for him and his camera crew to use to fool her. This is easily the best part of the episode, with Jimmy and Drama Girl doing accents to sell the ruse, and Jimmy coming up with a story on the spot about Huell saving people from a fire. I also love this scene where Mrs. Nguyen gives Jimmy relationship advice, but it turns out in his case, the best way to mend a relationship is to commit highly illegal crimes. After this, Kim is clearly bored by her normal work with Mesa Verde, so she tells Jimmy she wants to do it again. Meanwhile, Mike and the German gang go to a strip club, and Mike and Werner have a one-on-one hangout sesh where they have a conversation about their past and stuff. Kai causes a ruckus and Mike has to deal with him, and when he gets back to Werner, he finds out he's been blabbing about the lab construction, which is basically the beginning of the end for him. Nacho flexes his alpha leadership on Crazy 8 and goes home to his crackhead girlfriends, and then at the end of the episode we're finally introduced to Lalo, who gives some very subtle foreshadowing on Nacho's eventual fate.
Nunca en tu vida has probado algo tan delicioso, ¿eh? De verdad. Mira, espérame. Te vas a morir.
Number 10. Witness. After a bit of a low-key season opener, the second episode of season 3 kicks it into high gear with an insanely good episode. Mike's detective work from last episode finally pays off with the epic reveal of Pollo's Hermanos, and he enlists Jimmy to go in and find out what's going on. I love seeing Jimmy really out of his element but still putting in the effort to do the job properly, and the gag of him filling his coffee with loads of sugar and being disgusted when he drinks it is good shit. Saul meets Gustavo, which is something the writers couldn't really do in the show since Saul doesn't know Gus in Breaking Bad, but they managed to get away with it anyway, and it's a sight to behold. Jimmy's enthusiasm to be doing detective work with Mike is sadly cut off by Mike being Mike. We meet Francesca, who's looking a lot happier than she did in Breaking Bad, and Jimmy puts her to work immediately. Ernesto tells Kim about Chuck's tape, so she gets Jimmy to give her $1, like how he does with Walt and Jesse in Breaking Bad. Jimmy's clearly disturbed by the fact that Chuck got one over him for once, but Kim is confident they can get past it. There's this highly amusing scene of Howard running through people's backyards, and then we arrive at possibly my favourite scene of the whole series, Jimmy breaking into Chuck's house. Odenkirk is so good at angry screamer performances, and his line deliveries here are the stuff of legends.
You pulled that heartstrings con job on me, you piece of shit! No wonder Rebecca left you. For this, you destroyed our family? You happy now? For what? For nothing! Is that all there is, Chuck? That's all there is? How'd you make copies, huh, Chuck?
Number 9. Wexler v. Goodman. After a couple of kinda average episodes to start off season 5, the writers dropped this insane episode on us out of nowhere. With a title like Wexler v. Goodman, you would have high hopes, and of course it delivers in every way imaginable. Jimmy assembles his elite film crew for his latest project, and after some arguing over how to go about it, they use a green screen and we get another delightful montage of Saul directing actors. Kim decides she wants to pump the brakes on the scheme, and Saul does seem to relent. Nacho finds out that Mike works for Gus and isn't impressed because Gus is a massive dickhead. Kim apologizes for the outburst she had in the previous episode, and because Rich is the best boss ever, he's cool with it. Mike does his Mike thing and gets this librarian to report Lalo's car and get him arrested. Jimmy uses 2 hookers to troll Howie some more, and Cliff is there to see it all go down. And then we get the Mesa Verde meeting, with all the big players, including Viola. Jimmy goes full Saul mode and bamboozles everyone, including Kim, who of course gets mad, but instead of dumping Jimmy, she drops the bomb that they should get married. I do find it kind of weird that Kevin Wachtel doesn't understand basic copyright law, and that this logo thing didn't ever come up in Mesa Verde's life, but it's still an amazing scene despite that. And the argument in Kim's apartment afterwards is even better, with her dropping an F-bomb almost as good as Howard's.
Wait, how can you be the sucker? It was your plan.
Oh, fuck you, Jimmy!
And on top of all of that, we get to see young Kim and her shitty mum in the cold open. This is just one of those episodes that's so much fun to watch unfold, and it would be my favourite Season 5 episode if it wasn't for one other that we'll get to shortly. Number 8. Bad Choice Road. After an episode as crazy as Bagman, it would have been totally logical for the writers to reel things in a bit for this episode, but instead they went whole hog. The split screen Something Stupid montage makes a return, and Jimmy and Mike get some new drip. I have got to find out Mike's skincare routine. Jimmy gets Lalo out of jail, and Lalo compliments him on his ability to pick up women. Kim clearly doesn't buy Jimmy's story about what went down in the desert, even after his harrowing confession of having to drink his own piss. Jimmy has an epic fail in court, and Oakley mocks him for it because he's a dick. Mike gives Jimmy a pep talk about choices and roads, as well as dropping some hints on what will happen to Lalo, but Jimmy isn't entirely grateful for the advice. Gus and Mike discuss their battle plan moving forward, and Gus continues to be the biggest Nacho hater on the planet. Kim has a moment of clarity at work and quits Schweikart and Coakley on the spot, and I love how we don't get to hear her say it, but instead figure it out from Rich's reaction. Nacho is tasked with the job of chauffeuring Lalo around as he does his detective work, and we get some more of his insane parkour skills. I really dig the score during this scene, which ends up being used as Lalo's theme throughout the rest of the show. And then we arrive at the main event. While Jimmy and Kim are arguing about her decision to quit, Lalo shows up for an interrogation session. It's a great detail that Jimmy tells the story differently each time Lalo gets him to repeat it to make the lie more believable. When Kim joined in to start roasting Lalo, the scene suddenly gets 1,000 times more tense, because it really feels like Lalo's just gonna pop a cap in her at any moment. This scene is nearly 12 minutes of perfect writing and acting, and will definitely go down as one of the best moments of this show. Number 7. Point and shoot. For what is effectively the second half of one big episode, Point and Shoot gets right to the point and wastes no time in making things happen. Lalo's plan to use Jimmy and Kim is a bit odd first time watching, but Saul's commitment to protecting Kim is admirable, considering how quickly he switches from petrified to convincing Lalo. It does seem like that he's just being a dick at first, but we get to figure out with Kim what his real motive is as the scene progresses. Lalo finally brings up Nacho, which sets up Jimmy's usage of him as a scapegoat in any future life-threatening situations. Kim goes for a nighttime drive to Gus's house, with some very obvious callbacks to Breaking Bad. Mike is a giant idiot throughout the entirety of this episode, but that's okay, because it means Gus has to get the dirty work done himself for once. Kim fills in Mike on what the situation is, and he struts off to do nothing, while Gus questions Kim on Lalo's motives. One of the things I was hoping for this season was Kim meeting Gus, and this is as close as we realistically could have gotten, so I'll take it. Gus realizes what Lalo is cooking, so he takes his lackeys over to the laundry, where they are instantly gunned down. Lalo forces him down into the lab with a bullet of encouragement to motivate him, and I think at this point we all kind of guessed how the showdown was going to go down, with obvious foreshadowing a few episodes earlier. Despite that, this is still a very satisfying scene, with Gus getting his Nacho moment in whining about Don Eladio and the Salamancas on camera, and Giancarlo's delivery here is some of his best work.
Chacales. Eso es todo lo que son. Estúpido. Impulsivo.
Lalo's supreme confidence in every moment of his sequence is just great to see, and his final moments as he dies are just perfect. And just when you think the episode can't get any better, Lyle shows up singing the Pollo's theme song to demonstrate one last time that he truly is the most dedicated fast food worker in the country. Afterwards, Jimmy and Kim reunite, and Mike gives them the hard reality on what's going to happen to Howard. I love how you can tell Mike is not at all impressed with their trolling of Howard, and that an innocent man is dead as a result of it.
You woke up, you found her, that's all you know.
Didn't make a lick of sense. Then he left, that's all you know.
The last scene of Lalo and Howard being buried in the same hole is truly harrowing, and is one of the darkest moments of the show. Also, the score for this episode is exceptional, hitting hard for both the action-packed moments and the somber ones. Number 6. Saul Gone. I'll be honest, going into the final episode of this show, I was a bit uncertain if it would be able to live up to the insurmountable hype, but it turns out I had nothing to worry about. Saul Gone manages to be the perfect send-off to Jimmy McGill, Better Call Saul, and the entire Breaking Bad universe. The big question hanging over the show for years was if Jimmy was truly capable of changing for the better, or if he was destined to sink deeper and deeper for the rest of his life. At first, it really does seem like he was beyond saving, with him manipulating Marie and everyone else into basically getting him off scot-free. But when he finds out Kim has already confessed her sins involving Howard's murder, he has something of a revelation and decides to throw it all away to clear his conscience and win back the respect of the one person he cared about.
I just wanted her to come here today. I wanted her to hear this.
Jimmy's testimony was everything I hoped it would be, with him finally acknowledging that Chuck's death was his fault and that he misses him more than anything. And him finally referring to himself by his real name is one of the all-time greatest moments of the show.
The name's McGill. I'm James McGill.
The 3 scenes set in the past give us insight into how Jimmy has always been hiding his true feelings from everyone, and the last scene of Chuck shows us that the moment Jimmy would go back to is the last chance he had to repair his relationship with his brother. And at the end of it all, Jimmy gets one last smoke of Kim before living out the rest of his life as a prison celebrity. So Jimmy's story ended perfectly, and on top of all of that, Bill Oakley is back to get strung along by Saul one more time, perhaps as revenge for all those times Oakley was a dick to him. He also gives us one of the funniest lines in the show.
Your Honor, I'd like to petition to withdraw from this case.
Denied.
Mike's final scene is amazing, and I do like the Walt scene too, but it does feel a bit redundant considering it serves basically the same purpose as the Mike scene, but with a more annoying character. But yeah, this was everything I could possibly want out of a finale to one of my favourite shows, and yes, I do think it's better than Felina. Number 5. Pimento.
You're not a real lawyer.
What a way to turn the entire show on its head. This episode drops the bombshell that Chuck has been against Jimmy all along, and goddamn, I think it might just be my favourite scene in the entire series, which I know I've said a million times, but this time I mean it. This might be a hot take, but I would say this Chuck rant is even better than the one in Chicanery. All Jimmy wanted his entire life was the approval of his brother, to be his equal, and to find out that not only has Chuck secretly resented him this entire time, but was actively working to undermine him is just too much. It also shows just how much of a baby Chuck really is, considering he acts like Jimmy didn't have to put in any work compared to him, even though he's fully aware that Jimmy worked tirelessly to put himself through law school without any help and while working at HHM.
This must have taken you years, and you kept it a secret all this time.
And on top of all of that, Jimmy was doing quality lawyer work these past few episodes, but Chuck is just too blinded by his bias to see it. Like I mentioned before, it's amazing how unexpected this twist is, but also how obvious it is when you look back at Chuck's actions throughout the season.
Because I always do. It's a habit, right? So it was nagging me. It was nagging me.
On the Mike side of things, we get the introduction of the best character in the entire show, and one of the all-time great Mike moments, where he disarms Trevor and makes him his bitch. Even Man Mountain is impressed. This scene where Mike gives Price a pep talk about being a criminal sums up his philosophy pretty much perfectly, and is the exact opposite of Chuck's rant in regards to how each of them view the law. Chuck's reaction to Howard denying Jimmy his job at HHM is just hilariously bad.
I am very disappointed.
And man, I feel bad for Howard, not just in this episode, but pretty much the entire show. The guy was just trying to run a decent law firm and kept having to deal with Chuck's petty beef with Jimmy until it destroyed everything. This episode manages to balance the devastating moments with the comedy moments so well, as easily my favourite episode of Season 1. Number 4. Plan and Execution. This is currently the highest rated episode of the show, the only one with a 9.9 rating on IMDb, and it's easy to see why. Jimmy and Kim's trolling against Howard finally all comes together, and it's really everything you could possibly want. The film crew returns one more time for a photo shoot, and it's a great send-off to some of the best side characters in the show. Unfortunately, we never got to find out if they were the ones making the Saul commercials in Breaking Bad, but I guess you can't have everything. The reveal that Howard's PI was actually working for Jimbo and Kim all along was a pretty crazy moment, especially with how quickly it happened. The mediation at HHM goes down as terribly as you would expect, with pretty much all the major law characters plus Irene Landry there to witness Howard's downfall. This is his last episode in the spotlight, and Patrick Fabian just nails every single scene. He does seem to convince Cliff that it's all Jimmy's fault, but it doesn't end up mattering because the clients are more important at the end of the day. Meanwhile, Lalo's back from his vacation in Germany and is finally zeroed in on the laundry, where of course the half-finished lab is under it. He gives Hector a call but realizes that Gus is onto him, which causes him to have a gamer rage before coming up with a new idea. Howard's confrontation with Jimmy and Kim is incredible, with Patrick Fabian giving a genuinely Emmy-worthy performance, even though the Emmys hate the show.
Howard's daddy helped him get to the top, but you both had to struggle. Howie has so much, and we have so little. Let's take him down a peg or two.
I've never hated Jimmy and Kim more than in this scene, and I was really looking forward to Howard getting his revenge until the candle flickers and Lalo comes in to ruin it. The first time watching this episode, it was just unbelievable that Howard and Lalo were in the same shot together, to the point where I thought it was like a fan edit. And unfortunately, Howard gets unceremoniously capped by Lalo, leaving us on the most painful cliffhanger ever.
Okay. Let's talk.
Thomas Schnauz and the rest of the writers brought these two plotlines together in such an unexpected but natural way, and it might just be the best writing in the entire show. The only reason this isn't number one is because there's 3 more that I think are even better, starting with number 3, Fun and Games. This is basically the series finale of the main era of Better Call Saul, with every episode after this being mostly Gene shenanigans. The opening montage with the Perfect Day song is amazing as usual, with some pretty funky transitions back and forth between Jimmy, Kim, and Mike's cleanup crew. Gus has a meeting with Don Eladio and the gang to discuss Lalo's murder, but Lalo did such a good job at faking his death that it ends up clearing Gus's name. This last scene of Gus and the wine guy was kind of controversial at first since it felt like it went on forever, but I think it's pretty much a perfect final scene for him, showing that even with the defeat of Lalo, he's still consumed by revenge, which would eventually lead to his downfall in Breaking Bad. It's also basically confirmation that Gus is gay, but people will still just keep denying it forever. Mike's last scene is also appropriate, with Nacho's father telling him the truth that he's become a soulless murder man working for a deranged psycho with no morals. Mike and Gus have finally become what they were in Breaking Bad, and I think it was a perfect way to end their stories. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Kim have to go to Howard's memorial at HHM with some very charming photos of the man himself. Rich tells us that HHM is downsizing and sums up the entire episode in 4 words.
End of an era.
Yeah.
Jimmy is accosted by Cheryl about his trolling of Howard, and Kim steps in to gaslight to the fucking max. This is probably the lowest we've ever seen her go. Jimmy and Kim's breakup is truly heartbreaking, even if it felt inevitable. Odenkirk and Seahorn are both at the top of their game as expected.
No, Kim, you're wrong. This is about Howard. Okay, what happened to him wasn't on us. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't my fault. It was that fucking Lalo Salamanca.
And the way the scene unfolds is like one gut punch after another. And that hard cut to Jimmy in full Saul mode is just genius. I am a tiny bit salty that we didn't get to see how Saul got the Cadillac and the inflatable and the office renovations, but it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. What does matter is that this episode managed to tie up all the loose ends and not feel rushed, which is amazing considering where the story was just a few episodes ago. And goddamn, that final shot is the stuff of legends. Number 2. Chicanery. What can be said about this episode that hasn't already been said a million times in 1,000 different video essays? Chicanery is the culmination of the growing rift between Jimmy and Chuck, and it's perfection. Every single moment and line of dialogue is crucial. No time is wasted. This might be the most airtight script in the series. If you pay close enough attention, you could probably figure out exactly what Jimmy and Kim's plan is before Chuck even arrives to give his testimony, but even with that knowledge, it's still so satisfying to watch it all play out. This scene of Jimmy and Kim gearing up for the hearing while we hear the prosecutor's opening statement is very Kino, and Kim's cross-examination of Howard has some great lines.
Nepotism. Your firm is Hanlon, and McGill, right? Who's the other Hamlin?
My father.
Eventually, he was hired by the firm of Davis and Main. I'd be happy to say more about that.
No, thank you.
We get the introduction of everyone's favourite cannibal, Huel, thanks to the ever-helpful Caldera. Once Jimmy gets to cross-examine Chuck, it's like a slow back and forth of who seemingly has the upper hand, until that final reveal of the battery in Chuck's pocket, where we realise Jimmy has been playing him the whole time. I love how throughout the episode you can see how much Jimmy hates that he has to do this to Chuck.
You know, she's gonna hate you when this is over.
Yep.
And there's no look of satisfaction or joy on his face at the end, just pain. Chuck's rant at the end may be a giant meme at this point, but it's still one of the best moments in the show, with him finally letting out all his petty rage against Jimmy in front of everyone. And a cool detail that I noticed during his rant is that he gets the 1216 address wrong. It's supposed to be 1261, but he says 1216, so it literally makes the mistake right there. So yeah, everything about this episode is top tier, and it may just well be the best episode of Better Call Saul. Except there's just one more that I think is even better. Number 1. Winner. For most people, chicanery will take that number 1 spot, but when it came down to it, Winner is so important for both Jimmy and Mike's character arcs that it had to be the number 1 for me. The cold open is everyone's favourite, and for good reason. After leaving Chuck and Jimmy's relationship on such a bitter note, to see them sing ABBA together on stage is almost euphoric, and what a perfect song to summarise not just his episode, but their dynamic as a whole. And of course, Chuck upstages Jimmy with his superior singing skills, because that's what he always does. For all we know, this could be the last time Jimmy and Chuck were truly happy together, and for that, this scene is extra tragic. Jimmy's plan to build up his reputation before his big hearing leads to some pretty amusing moments, like fake crying in front of Chuck's grave and donating money to the Charles McGill reading room. My favourite scene in this episode is when Jimmy attends a voting committee to give out scholarships, where he vouches for Christy Esposito, who has a past a lot like his. Jimmy's motivational speech to her about how the winner takes it all is just amazing, and his breakdown after the Suzuki won't start is even more so. The Mike side of the story is just as engaging, with him on the hunt for Werner after he went AWOL, and with Lalo hot on his trail. This leads to this awesome scene where Mike outsmarts Lalo with chewing gum, and we get the introduction of Lalo's acrobatic skills. When Mike finally does get his hands on Werner, Gus says that he has to die, so Mike decides to do it himself. This scene is just brutal and so important for Mike's character, since this is the first murder we see him commit since those 2 cops in 5-0. Jimmy gives his appeal to the bar committee and charms everyone there, including Kim. And of course he reveals it was all just a bit of trolling, and leaves both Kim and the audience on one of the best endings for an episode ever.
It's all good, man.
Winner is the perfect conclusion to every aspect of Season 4, and it's my pick for the best episode of Better Call Saul. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's just rank each season real quick. So there you have it. No matter what episode or season you think is the best, what I think we can all agree on is that this show is one of the best of all time. I know someone else beat me to the punch with this video, and it's been a bit of time since I last uploaded, but that's what I get for being lazy and unproductive, I guess. If this video somehow wasn't enough for you and you want to hear me and some other people talk about this show for even longer, then I have discussions on each episode of Season 6 on my channel for your listening pleasure. So be sure to comment your favourite or least favourite episodes, and perhaps consider subscribing if you want to wait another 10 years for my next video.